Are things as they seem? It's an interesting question. What I always like to do, if you ask me a question, this is coming from Henry Benjamin. He actually says, how likely do you think it is that things are how they actually appear? Perhaps things are as they appear, and the focus on alternatives, because we're using our language carefully here. Given the context of the whole conversation, of course, everything is about context. If you say something in a certain context, that's okay, but in another context, not so okay. So we're being choosy with our language. And he says, he would say, a proportion of the population are speaking about and listening to conspiracies. Counter to this, there are people watching porn, playing video games, drugged by entertainment, so perhaps these conspiracy theorists really are inconsequential when compared to the oppressive effects the internet has. So, you haven't studied history. Just in general, I say you, I'm not speaking to Henry Benjamin. I'm maybe speaking to an audience. I don't know if I'm speaking to you in particular. But it's just the general second person, the you. Just my experience interacting with other people is that most people do not study history. I'm not talking about ancient history. Because the farther back you go, the more distorted history gets, and the more people project their current misconceptions back onto the past. And so that process of projection actually means you have deluded people who have no clue what's going on. They project their delusions onto the past, which they don't know what the past is, so their delusions are amplified. And so they're like, oh, the Romans were, insert whatever projection is here. So if it's a right-wing person, they'll say, well, the Romans were like basically National Socialists, and like the Romans practiced like eugenics and insert the blank, whatever. On the left, they'll say like the Romans were multiculturalists, and they actually got a lot of their knowledge from Africa because the Egyptians started Romans and Egyptians were black. So whatever your current delusion or misconception is, whatever your skewed bias is, as people look at history, they just project that back, and it just amplifies. It gets out of control. So when we're talking about history, I'm not even talking about ancient history. I'm not talking about far away lands. I'm not talking about like esoteric stuff. That's usually what people think when you talk about history. It's like esoteric things that don't really pertain to the present day. It doesn't really matter. Things that I talk about, like ancient Greece. When I say history, I'm not even going that deep. I'm using the most like superficial, like recent history. Like, do people remember 2008? Do people remember 2001? Do people remember the 1990s? Do people remember the 1980s? Okay. You go back a few decades and just there's this total, and it's funny because people have this assumption that this is a problem with young people, that young people, it was before their time, these Zoomers, they don't know what's going on, these 20-somethings, these teenagers, they just don't know what's going on, and if you're an older person, you remember what America used to be like. That's actually not true. And this isn't just an anecdotal thing of, oh, I had a conversation with a boomer, and the boomer said something progressive, and therefore, this is proof of something like that. Of course, we've all had those experiences of boomers saying progressive things. Anecdotally, boomers also say pretty anti-progressive things. But statistically, when you look at Pew, and you look at things like trans acceptance, questions like, on government ID, should there be an option other than male and female? So, other, trans, etc. Gender fluid, I don't know. There's a lot of different terminology out there. I'm very ignorant of it. But we're talking about this question, and you look at the different age brackets, and it's like 60% of young people are like, yes, go ahead. And young people being like teenagers, 20-somethings. And then you get into your Gen X, and then it's down to 50%. And then you get into a little bit older than Gen X. You start to get into your boomers, and then all of a sudden they're like, only 40%. And then you're looking at, say, people who are older than the boomers, say, like silent generation, really old people, like 80-year-old people. And you start asking them, do you think there should be an alternative option? And rather than being 40% in favor, they're like 30% in favor. So still, 70% of these really old folks, you ask them about this, they'll say, that's crazy. But 30% are saying, oh, yeah, that's acceptable, that's fine. Understand that the term transgender, look, I don't know, everyone has their own perspective. I'm just saying I had to learn. There was a day I remember, in particular, I remember hearing the word gay and not knowing what that meant. We're at a point now where that would be like saying one day you hear the word tree and you don't know what it means. There are certain words in the English language that are just so popular and fundamental that you're not going to have a memory of the day, what does that word mean, tree? But I remember I didn't know what gay was. I didn't know, what do you mean gay? What is that word? I remember not knowing, and maybe I just grew up in a cave. I grew up, in a like Oscar the Grouch. It was like living in my trash can, like this very hermetic existence. I was like living inside a giant bowl, like some ancient Greek philosopher, with my dog, and I don't know, it's some ridiculous situation here. But I'm just thinking there was a time when kids grew up, theoretically, and they just weren't exposed to certain things, and they didn't know that certain things existed. It didn't exist in the social consciousness, in the social majority. It just was non-existent. It didn't exist. It didn't have any attention drawn to it. No one's attention was focused on that except professors, university people, academics, self-described Marxists, right? A very minority, a small fringe of people cared about like trans issues 20 years ago. Frankly, I didn't know it existed. Frankly, the kind of questions that people would, like really on the real far left, real liberal, you start getting in discussions 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and people are like, is it possible to be in the closet? Is everyone repressing their sexuality? And it was a binary between straight and gay. It's like you were either a straight person, or the worst case scenario, or like the most out there, the crazy scenario, be like, maybe you're gay. Maybe the reason why you're a homophobe is because you're secretly gay. That was the meme that was going on. So this question of trans, like trans didn't exist. It did not exist as a concept that people could think of. I guess the closest thing you had transvestite, and transvestism was either a joke, it was a funny joke, oh, he's wearing a dress, that's comical. Or it was, oh, that's a gay man, and part of his fetishistic sexual lifestyle, which includes a whole lot more things than just putting on a skirt, but that's part of it. That's part of his fetishistic lifestyle. So it's sort of just a symptom or an off-branch of that thing that we're more familiar with. But the idea of trans as a separate and distinct category and everything like that, all of that was an innovation within the last 20 years. And now it's the big topic. It's the big thing that we're focusing our attention on. So it's, I think of stuff like that, and I think there is no such thing as the organic. There is no such thing as the spontaneous. There's no such thing as the emergent. There's no such thing as, oh, well, humanity is just educating itself. These elites, they're just busy making money. They're people like you and me. They don't know what's going on. They're confused, and they just have a lot of money, but they're also very ignorant. They don't know what's going on because the universe is just so chaotic, man. I mean, it actually physically hurts to try to go down this line of reasoning. Like, oh yeah, the elites, they don't know what's going on, and they're, Donald Trump surprised the elites. That kind of thinking, that very democratic thinking, this, oh, it's like chaos theory and black swan events and everything's so crazy and unpredictable. No one could have predicted it. Who's Oswald Spengler? No one could have predicted this. No, it's all too complicated and complex. What's psychology? What's mass psychology? Never heard of that. What's going on? No one knows. It's all just a big surprise. Surprise! Donald Trump was elected. It was a surprise. No one could have predicted that. The mainstream media said Hillary was going to win 80%. Don't you remember Nate Silver? He said 80% Hillary's going to win. So obviously, Donald Trump, he pulled a big fast one on the media. They were totally taken by surprise, implying that somehow the media is just like George Soros and Bloomberg and Epstein or any of the billionaire. Bill Gates is like, hey, you know what I think, CNN? I believe, or Sumner Redstone goes to CNN or ABC or Fox News, and he says, hey, look, here's what I personally think, and this is what I want you to print. Or that the journalists are like, oh, I'm just going to print whatever I want. I mean, the idea that journalists have this kind of freedom to just think whatever they want and say whatever they want, the idea that's how journalism works in the first place is stupid. So we put that to the side. Then we have the idea that, like, the elites seriously thought Trump was going to lose. They thought there was like an 80% chance Hillary was going to win. And so they were like, yeah, this is what we honestly think. We want you to tell millions of Americans what we honestly think. No! The polls that were put out were intentionally there for a number of reasons. Now, at first I thought this was counterintuitive. I thought, well, if you say it's 80% Hillary, that's just going to ramp up Trump voters, and Trump voters are going to get mad, and they're going to be energized to go out the polls. My personal feeling was, if you feel like the opposition is going to win, you're going to fight harder against them. But that's not actually how mass psychology works. My intuition was wrong. And frankly, the way mass psychology works is when you feel like you're losing, you tend to give up. When you feel like you're winning, you invest more. You invest more. When you feel like you're more and more certain of winning, you invest more and more and more and more. Doesn't make sense to me. I'm looking at it from like, you've got stocks and you've got bonds, you've got assets, and you've got shell companies and corporations, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna move 100 million into this one because this one's doing good, this one's succeeding, this one's failing. So wait, I guess I just proved. I don't know what I'm saying. I guess take everything I said and reverse that. So this company's failing, so we're going to invest more into that to save it. This company's doing good, so we can forget about it. Not, yeah. So anyway, mass psychology, just kind of forget everything I've said and just understand the simple point that when people feel like they're winning, they invest more. When people feel like they're losing, they get demoralized. Okay, so this is how warfare works. This is how politics works. So that was an attempt on the media part to pump up Hillary and to demoralize Trump voters. It wasn't an accurate representation of what the quote-unquote elite really thought at the time. The idea that a public poll that goes out is an accurate representation, maybe it's what the pollsters think or whatever, but again, the idea that the pollsters just have free reign, that any pollster who wants to post a poll, do whatever they want, the whole thing is a little bit ridiculous. The idea that there is some kind of symmetry between the information you receive, and there's a kind of symmetry between that information and the kind of information that elites have access to, the idea that there's a symmetry there, that somehow if you were surprised that Donald Trump won, that therefore the elites were surprised, the billionaire class was surprised that Donald Trump won, the idea that there's a symmetry between those two things, I think, is pretty ridiculous. I think throughout history, we've always had asymmetries of information. There's always been a class which has been literate, a class which has been illiterate. Now, today, everyone can pretty much read outside of, certain no-go zones or whatever, underdeveloped areas or, say, urbanized areas. But most people can read. And so it's not about can you read, but it's what are you reading, where's your attention focused. And frankly, I just don't buy into this. I don't buy into this because I know if I was wealthy, I would know everything I know and then some. You know, if I was wealthy, first of all, there's a selection bias there where in order to become wealthy, you have to kind of know what's going on. You kind of have to be ahead of the curve to predict where you invest your funds. You have to be well connected, you know, so you're integrated into a higher social sphere, not the social sphere down here that most people are plugged into or not plugged into. Increasingly, people just don't have a social sphere. Increasingly, the social sphere is this internet thing. I think the slogan of Snapchat is real friends, real you, which is just the most, I mean, this is what I'm saying here. When someone says to me, how likely do you think it is that things are how they actually appear? I don't know. Have you seen an advertisement recently? Have you researched sales? This is the most basic thing that I think everyone can understand. The idea that is an advertisement real? So an advertisement says, we have the best cars, we have the best cruises, we have the best food. When an advertisement says something like that, how likely do you think it is that things are how they actually appear? Do you really think it's the best just because the advertisement said so? Is that really what you believe? I mean, if so, I wish I could validate the old trope that there are no stupid questions, but no, advertisements are fake and false. Advertisements appear to be one way, they seem to be one thing, and they're quite the opposite. You know, they promise something too good to be true. Scams exist. So, I don't know. And it's like, I don't know how much proof people need. People are just like, I don't know. I guess there's so much stigma, and there's so much, you know, I was thinking about the Matrix today. I was like, the Matrix, okay, so it's like, I guess the idea of the Matrix is like to be hedonistically, blissfully ignorant is evil, and to accept the real truth that we're actually like, you know, in rags and we're eating gruel and we live like in this disgusting, dirty underbelly of this electronic city, and the earth is covered in dark clouds and thunder. And it's just a terrible hellscape. It's like Sheol. It's like a Plutonic thing. You know, we should accept that versus like the Platonic view, which is, I said Plutonic before, now we're talking about Platonic. Don't get confused. Plutonic meaning of Plato, of Hades. Platonic meaning of Plato, the philosopher. So the Platonic view is that, you know, the real world of forms, the divine world of forms is beautiful, and that we need to emulate that divine world of forms within our own lives to approximate it in order to achieve harmony with this divine world and reject the material world. So both the Christian idea, which is then brought into the hyper-modern technological realm with the movie The Matrix, has been analyzed a million times before. It's been done before, and that's the Christian view, that the material world is evil, therefore you should be poor, and you should wear rags, and you should get sacrificed and turn the other cheek, and basically just allow yourself to be led to the slaughter, and that means you're a martyr, and that means you're a holy person in Christianity. And within the world of the Matrix, you're supposed to reject the steak dinner, you're supposed to reject the beautiful women, you're supposed to reject wealth and power, you're supposed to say, no, I want to get out of the Matrix, and I want to go live in the real world of rags and gruel and darkness and disgusting, dirty places. That's the true, honorable, good thing to do. So that's the Christian Matrix method or message. And then the Platonic is like, no, that's more like an aristocratic Nietzschean. It's like, no, there's a true world of Platonic forms, of like divine perfection. And by having a beautiful, delicious steak dinner, by wearing nice clothing, by being smart, by having cool technologies, we're getting closer to that. We're getting closer to that Platonic realm of forms. So two views of things that we're looking at there. I don't know why I'm even mentioning that. Another thing I wanted to mention, another random aside, another ramble to go off on and then not really finish, is the idea that the Spartans were like in favor of death. And if that was the case, you'd expect the chief Spartan god to be Pluto. It would be Pluto, god of death. Sorry, wrong answer. The correct answer was Apollo, god of the sun. So Apollo, god of the sun, who the Apollonian, that was their chief god, not the god of death. The Spartans. It's funny because now you have Europeans, and Europeans just think like genetics are stagnant, and Europeans have this idea like, well, our ancestors 40,000 years ago were this way, so that must mean that we today are also like that, because that's how genetics works. Genetics doesn't actually work that way. Genetics, and when we're talking about gene pools of a lot of different kinds of people, really the way that people go is they don't just remain in stasis. The only way people remain in stasis is if their environment remains in stasis. But if your environment changes, then you're creating different selective pressures. When you create different selective pressures, that means genetically your population is changing. Evolution doesn't stop, especially when you have human beings who are conscious, who can choose mates based off social categories. I mean, the idea, animals are just looking at physical characteristics. They don't have, I mean, I guess, wolves have alpha, beta, whatever. But most of it is centered on physical characteristics. So it's a pretty one-dimensional form of selection. I guess you could say some, peacocks have plumage. So it's both like you have the aesthetics of the plumage, and then can the peacock like run around and get food or whatever. So there's some multidimensionality there. But as you increase, here's my theory. As you increase the dimensionality of selective traits, meaning it's just not physical, it's not just aesthetic, but it's also psychological, social, economic. As you increase those factors, the dimensionality of selection, then you actually increase the rate and speed at which selective pressures become effective. So, the basic point here is that, like, you're not a Spartan. It's not to say that some traits, like, obviously the lizard brain all the way back here is pretty old. So I'm not saying, like, people don't have the capacity for being bestial. But what I'm saying is that, you're not the same as your ancestors. Especially with epigenetics. And you look into the study of epigenetics and you see that actually by starving your children, it will change their genetics, and they'll actually become hardier people. They'll actually become tougher. Like, this is not just me making this up. It is something where you look at, like, a grandparent goes through a period of starvation, and the grandchildren are more robust, and they're stronger, and they're taller, and everything like that. So epigenetics is real, and genetic drift is real, and selective pressure is real. And humans, because of the multidimensionality of our selective practices, we have this extreme selective pressure could just turn on a dime, and you can get massive changes in the population. And that's the genetic side of things. Now we have the mimetic side of things with the internet. People's ideas are just changing so rapidly in such radical directions. And I guess when we look at recent history, to leave the whole Pluto, Apollo, Spartans thing to the side, the recent history is like people think that school shootings are the worst thing that's ever happened, which is just, I can't wrap my head around it. I guess it's not that it's not that I don't understand it in terms of, well, I see these people freaking out, but it's like there's no context. There is no, like, objective standard of, like, hey, yeah, there's school shootings. Did we ever have shootings in the past? Did children ever die in the past? Like, there's no comparison. It's this totally, it's almost a narcissism. It's like a temporal narcissism where we look at our times and we think that our times are the most extreme, evil, crazy times that have ever existed. And it doesn't always pan out that way, sorry. Actually, children used to die all the time. Babies used to die all the time. Like, child mortality was just much, much higher. And people just lived in squalid conditions. And, things that today we would consider to be beyond the pale, just breaking all kinds of human rights. Back then, it was just like, hey, it's the norm. It's the norm. So, I don't know. I just think it's ridiculous. I think that the doolittling that goes out there, where people think, oh, this is more radical than ever. Have you heard of the Weather Underground? Like, again, it's just so basic. I wish I didn't have to, like, give you the Google search term. I wish you could just figure it out on your own, but it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating. And again, this isn't even, it's like Henry Benjamin says something, and he's a nice guy. He's saying something nice. He's just leaving it's not a disgusting comment, okay? Thumbs up. There needs to be more category. I have thumbs up, thumbs down, love, and then reply. But I also want a hate button, and then I want like a disgusting button. And his comment, it's not disgusting. We get all kinds of disgusting comments. It's not a disgusting comment. It's just it triggered me. It hit me. Just the way. Hey, have you ever considered the possibility that things are just as they seem? And I don't know. We can look at it from like a third-person perspective. We can look at the mainstream narratives on all kinds of things, and we can get into this recursive tautology. We never actually engage with what's going on, and we're just always like in this abstract space of like Occam's razor. Maybe things are as they appear. Like, just no. That's not, to me, that's not the simplest solution. The simplest solution is not like, okay, we have people who are known to be liars. Maybe their lies are actually the truth. No, the simplest solution to figure out what's going on is, if I was in power, what would I do? If I was in power and my only incentive was to keep in power, what would I do? Well, I'd lie. Okay, how would I lie? Well, I'd lie in these, I don't know, it's pretty predictable to me. So I don't think it's that complicated. Yeah, these whole things about when someone says something like, a portion of the population are speaking about listening to conspiracies, then everybody, I think he means a larger proportion. Counter to this, more people are watching porn, playing video games, drugged by the entertainment. So perhaps these conspiracy theorists really are inconsequential when compared to the oppressive effects the internet has. True. 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 And this kind of leads into what Brian G. said. Joel Davis has referred to politics being a matter of shared attention and shared intention. And then he talks about suppression of social connections by a lack of information technology. I didn't read that in the article. That's not the article that I read. I don't think he uses the term suppression, and I don't think he says we have a lack of information technology. I think he says we have too much information technology. So I don't know if we read the same article. Perhaps I read it wrong. Perhaps you read it wrong. We're going to have to go back to that. In olden times, information was limited. Nowadays, information is aperon. Aperon. I'm never going to pronounce that correctly. Attention is scrambled and overburdened. That is correct. An expert has only read or even been made aware of only a fraction of available material. Most people in earlier times would be illiterate, but thoroughly and organically learned in local folk culture. Given this situation and the idea of shared attention-intention, it's easy to envision how fractured we really are, as the thought is perhaps the evil incarnation of the net of Indra. So, yeah, you're being entrapped by overstimulation, too much information. It's what John David Ebert calls hypermodernity. It is a very valid thesis.